Detente. The Detente period, and again, here's one of these French words that we use like in diplomatic relations because French used to be the lingua franca back when the lingua franca was French. Like literally it means the language of the Franks or the language of the French. So French was the long time the language for international relations. Good? French was long time the language for international relations. Detente is a word that refers to an easing of tensions. And this easing of tensions is going to go even further than the easing of tensions that we already called the thaw of the Cold War, which was the 1950s. The 1970s will go even further than that did. Beginning around 1968, there is no date that detente begins, okay? There's no one that said, "Good morning! Today is a good day to detente." No, that didn't happen, okay? It's just a recognition, it's like this term that is given for this gradual easing of tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, but also between, for the United States perspective, also between us and China, and also between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. So everybody is getting into detente fever, well, everybody except for the Soviet Union and China. But we are going to use that for ourselves, our own advantage. So it's defined as a relaxation or an easing in tensions during the 1970s. And during this period, the United States and the Soviet Union and also the United States and China and Eastern Europe and Western Europe will work with each other to try to form more stable and cooperative relationships. Detente is born. Detente is born largely because of the dangers of nuclear war. We've already talked about the development of nuclear weapons, and by the 1960s, each side has got the capability to absolutely destroy the other. And even if a country strikes first, what is known as the first strike, would not guarantee to eliminate counter-strike possibilities from your opponent. So if the United States launched first, there's no way that we could guarantee take out all of the Soviets' nuclear weapons, and vice versa was true as well. And so we started to rely on this policy of mutually assured destruction, right? We talked about this already. Where the fear of each of us being eradicated in nuclear war would keep both of us from ever starting a nuclear war. But there's concern still with nuclear weapons. Their very existence allows for something to happen, mistakes to happen, new leadership maybe not seeing the same way that older leaders had seen. So as long as the nuclear weapons are there, the threat does remain. So one reason for the beginning of detente is the concern over the massive arsenals of nuclear weapons that each side has grown. For the Soviet Union, we've got some other concerns. For the Soviet Union, we've got some other concerns here. Their nation was going through some serious economic problems. Their economy had slowed growth to the point where it was not really growing at all. And this was a little shocking for the Soviet Union. Like if we were to look back at the Soviet Union in the 1950s, there were reasonable people that wondered whether the Soviet system was actually a better economic system than the American system. As the Americans experienced some recession in the 1950s, while the Soviets were experiencing unprecedented growth in the 1950s. Some would question whether their system was actually better. Well, as we got through the 1960s and into the 70s, that question started to be asked less. The Soviet Union's economy had ground to a halt. Now, the reality was, after World War II, the Soviet Union had a lot of rebuilding to do, right? They had to put themselves back together after the war. We didn't. So that ended up being an economic boom for the Soviet Union. But this would not last. So they need to improve their people's standard of living. They want to improve their people's standard of living. And in a Soviet-style system, remember, the government controls all of the means of production. So if there could be better relations with the United States, if we could reduce the military tensions, same thing we saw during the thaw of the 1950s. If you could reduce the military obligations, you might be able to divert more spending towards consumer spending. So we've got the fear of nuclear war, we've got economic problems that the Soviet Union is dealing with, and then we've got to talk about China. And we've already mentioned this. The relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union was not as dangerous or as tense as the relationship between China and the Soviet Union was in the late 1960s. In fact, what did the Soviet Union and China do in 1969? They fought a small war against each other. So we never got to that point with the Soviets. So the Soviet Union hoped that an easing of tensions with the United States, if the Soviet Union and the United States could open up a dialogue and open up a relationship with each other, that might keep the United States from opening up a relationship with China. That might isolate and weaken China further. So that's why the Soviet Union was willing to look towards détente. The American rationale? Well, what's going on for the United States in 1968-69 when Nixon comes into office? War. What war? Vietnam War. And what does President Nixon promise as he's running for election? Promises to get America out of the war, to end the war in Vietnam. Well, who could really help the United States end the war in Vietnam? The Soviet Union and China could absolutely lend a hand in convincing North Vietnam to negotiate an end to this war. Why would North Vietnam listen to the Soviets? Why would North Vietnam listen to China? They're supplying them. They're giving them arms. So the United States had hoped that maybe by easing a relationship with the Soviets or the Chinese, and the Chinese, that might help us get out of this Vietnam mess. This is the pursuit of what Henry Kissinger, who is an important figure for our story now, Henry Kissinger was President Nixon's national security advisor, later to be his Secretary of State. Henry Kissinger was Nixon's chief foreign policy advisor. Nixon believed in what is known as realpolitik. Think of it as real politics, being realistic, being pragmatic. Prior to Nixon's administration, the United States saw the world very much the way NSC 68 described it. Communism is bad. It's all being directed out of Moscow, and the United States should increase our spending to stop that spread of communism wherever it is. And of course, that gets us involved in Korea, that gets us involved in Vietnam, that gets us involved in Cuba, right? Well, Kissinger in realpolitik says, yeah, okay, communism is bad. We don't like communism. We don't want communism for us. We don't want it to spread. But, there's maybe more important issues out there. Like maybe a positive relationship between the United States and China, or a positive relationship between the United States and Soviet Union, might ultimately make the United States stronger. Like, is the United States today economically stronger because we have a positive relationship with China? I think you have to say yes. They loan us half the money we need to borrow because we deficit spend all the time. And I like my iPhone. And you all like your iPhones, or whatever it is you use that's made in China. All right? So Kissinger in realpolitik says, you know what? Vietnam, on the whole, even though it's such a massive war for us and such a massive war for the Vietnamese, Vietnam is a small sliver of land in Southeast Asia. And it is hurting America worldwide. It's causing us serious issues on a global scale. We need to get out of that war. And having better relations with the Soviets and the Chinese, that is worth it to get out of this conflict.
So realpolitik is like a belief to improve relations by getting at the big picture?
Yeah, by looking at the big picture, by saying, if we want the best for the United States, we can't fight every war on every corner of the planet. Remember Nixon doctrine comes out after this? The Nixon doctrine that says a country must be responsible for its own defense. It can't solely be the United States. Henry Kissinger in realpolitik says there should be a balance between world powers, like the United States and the Soviet Union, of course, and China, but also Japan and East Asia. And Western Europe should have a part to play. That everybody should be at the table. It should not be this exclusive America versus the Soviet Union at every turn. So the hopes that the Americans had was that Detente could allow the Soviets and the Chinese to put pressure on the North Vietnamese. And we could actually increase our global footprint through negotiations, not confrontations. Negotiations are far cheaper than wars. And for America, too, we also had some economic issues we were dealing with. The early 1970s also brought economic problems for the United States, a phrase that combines two nasty words when you're dealing with economics. Stagnation means an economy that's not growing. Inflation means a rise in prices in an economy. When you have a stagnant economy at the same time your economy is suffering from inflation, we have what was born in the 1970s, stagflation. Sounds like a made-up word. It is. It's combining stagnation and inflation. But I didn't make it up, so we'll have to learn it. So the United States was having this weird economy where the economy wasn't really growing, but prices were on the rise. And there's a lot of economics reasons for this. One aspect that we'll talk about a little bit later in the class is the oil crisis in the early 1970s. You don't need to write about this right now, but we'll get to it when we deal with the Arab-Israeli crisis. Just hear it right now. In 1973, there's a war between Israel and its neighbors. And the oil-producing nations of the Middle East put an embargo on selling oil to any country supporting Israel. And it causes an oil shock around the planet. And oil prices skyrocket, and oil shortages, gasoline shortages, are on the rise. So when we add all this together, the United States has a slow-growing economy, but with inflation. And when you combine those two things, it's no good. Because that means you're not making any more money at your jobs, wages aren't rising, but prices for things that you need to buy are going up. The last few years in American economics, we've had pretty slow-growing economic growth, certainly since the Great Recession began. The economy was very stagnant. But we didn't have inflation either. There hasn't been much inflation over recent years. That's why we kind of weathered the storm. But if you combine inflation and a slow-growing economy, you got some problems. So that's why both countries want détente. Let's talk about what they actually did. Between the Soviets and the Americans, détente centers around nuclear arms reductions treaties. And here's where we have SALT, the Strategic Arms Limitation. First it's the talks, and then eventually the talks turn into a treaty. So SALT, this is known as SALT I, but much like Rocky was just Rocky until it was a big hit, and Sylvester Stallone made Rocky II, so then Rocky I became Rocky I. SALT I was just the SALT Treaty until they started working on a second SALT. But anyhow, the Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty, signed in 1972 between the United States and the Soviet Union, meant to limit nuclear capabilities of both nations. Interestingly enough, and kind of counterintuitively, I think we've already talked about this in this class, one of the first things dealt with in the SALT Treaty was not nuclear weapons, but actually anti-ballistic missiles. Those missiles that shoot down incoming nuclear missiles. The SALT Treaty limited the amount of anti-ballistic missile systems each side could have. And what was the reasoning, guys? We talked about this before. What was the reasoning behind limiting anti-ballistic missiles? You would think that's just defensive and that'd be a good thing. Yes?
So that, like, neither side could shoot down weapons, so, like, if one person could shoot down the weapons,
Okay, so if one side had successful anti-missile defense systems,
then they're defended when the other person
one side is defended, the other's not. So what do we lose? We lose the idea of MAD, mutually assured destruction. So taking away the anti-ballistic missiles keeps mutually assured destruction on the table, and we believe that mutually assured destruction keeps us safe. There would also be a temporary treaty signed during SALT. It's a part of the SALT agreement that limited the number of ICBMs. Those are those intercontinental ballistic missiles, those longest range missiles. So limit the number of ICBMs. Also limit the number of SLBMs, the sub-launched ballistic missiles. There was also an agreement within the SALT Treaty that said if we were ever having some serious issues and we were inching closer and closer to nuclear war between us, we need to talk to each other. An agreement by both sides to talk it out before we get to the point of nuclear war. Now, deep in the cynical crannies of your brain, what do you think about when I just said what I said? Sarika? It's not going to work. It probably wouldn't. It's probably not realistic. Like, if I'm so mad at you that I want to go to war, am I going to give you any heads up that that's going to happen? Maybe not. And some critics of these treaties would say just that. Why would the Soviet Union ever warn us? Why would they come to us? But then we have to also remember, nuclear war for one means nuclear war for all, and it means the destruction of everybody. So maybe that in and of itself says, okay, sounder minds would prevail. We have to talk these situations out. So some in America are going to think that this SALT agreement is terrible and it's weakening the United States. Some think it doesn't go far enough. For example, those MIRVs that had recently been developed, we talked about those before. Those multiple independently targeted re-entry vehicles, where one missile can break into numerous warheads. Those weren't dealt with in the SALT agreement. Which only means there can be a sequel to the SALT agreement, SALT II. SALT II was a series of negotiations between 1974 and 1979 that continued to discuss limits on what we call delivery vehicles, the long-range missiles, the bombers. SALT II also discussed a ban on the development of new ICBMs. But by the time we get to the end of this SALT II negotiations period, the Soviet Union is going to be invading Afghanistan. And the American Senate, though they ratified SALT I, that became an actual treaty. The American Senate never ratifies SALT II. So that never actually came to be. So SALT I happened. SALT II was worked on. These countries were still talking with each other. Here's even a photograph of Jimmy Carter and Leonid Brezhnev signing a temporary agreement, although it means nothing because the American Senate ratifies treaties. This is all an aspect of the Detente period, all right? That the two sides are talking with each other in hopes of limiting the military abilities of each side. Good? Good. I want to talk about agreements between East and West Germany and the Soviet Union. In 1970, the Moscow Treaty would be signed. This is between Poland and East Germany. But remember, who's always lurking behind the shadows of these East German states? Obviously, the Soviet Union is keeping an eye on what's going on. The Moscow Treaty of 1970. Well, the treaty itself is signed in Moscow. East Germany and Poland will officially agree to each other that their borders, as drawn up after World War II, do you guys remember the magical shifting Poland to the west? That those borders are now set in stone. Those are now officially recognized borders by those two nations. So the Poland that we see on the map today is essentially the Poland that we saw on the map back in after World War II. It didn't ever get shifted back. It never would push back to the east. East Germany and Poland. East Germany and Poland. In 1972, there's what's known as the quadripartite protocol. Oh my gosh, four-party. Quadripartite, four-party. Where East and West Germany would guarantee Berlin's security. You guys remember the problem with West Berlin was still it was stuck in the middle of East Germany. Well, now the security of West Berlin will be guaranteed. In 1972, East and West Germany will sign what's called the Basic Treaty, where each of them officially recognizes the other. And they will increase trade relationships between them. The Basic Treaty. Basic, like simple, basic. Like that's such a basic treaty. That's a word you kids use these days, right? Yeah. So just East Germany recognizes West Germany's existence and legitimacy. West Germany recognizes East Germany's, I can't even speak English anymore, existence and legitimacy. Good? And then the final treaty and the final agreement I want to talk about in Europe is called the Helsinki Accords, or the Helsinki Agreement. Helsinki is the capital of Finland. And these were resulted after a series of meetings from 1973 to 1975, where 33 nations got together in Europe and agreed to what become known as the Helsinki Agreement, or the Helsinki Accords. There are three aspects to this Helsinki Agreement, and they're referred to as baskets. As we can picture somebody in Finland carrying around a basket to grandma's house or something, I don't know. First, the security basket. That European borders could not be altered by force. That European borders could not be altered by force. And that West Germany and East Germany are recognized by both sides of the Cold War divide. Now, it sounds kind of crazy because remember back in the 1920s and 30s, we were talking about agreements in Europe that said not to use war and not to use military, and that didn't work out very well. Yet we are trying it again. These countries are pledging to not tinker with their borders by force. Basket 2. First basket was the security basket. Now we've got the cooperation basket. Encouraging East and West in Europe to collaborate in economic and scientific and cultural fields, to open up new trade and cultural connections between East and West. Eastern and West Europe, yeah, like over the Iron Curtain that was previously talked about. The third basket, human rights. That all 33 signatories agree to respect human rights and individual freedoms. Now, this is problematic, especially if you're Leonid Brezhnev, the leader of the Soviet Union that's got a pretty checkered past when it comes to individual freedoms. Like when we talk about individual freedoms, what kinds of things do you think people start thinking about? Free speech. Yeah. Freedom to protest. Very good. What else? Maybe religious freedom, right? The ability to vote and choose our leaders. These gets talked about. And obviously when we got East and West Europe talking to each other, Western Europe has these things. Eastern Europe doesn't. Leonid Brezhnev was not down with this third human rights basket, because this could threaten his control over Eastern Europe. But ultimately, he agreed to the Helsinki Accords. Because Brezhnev wanted the first and the second agreements. He wanted cultural trading and economic ties. He wanted the security blanket. He wanted the security basket that lessened tensions because he needed to ease up the military tensions in the Soviet Union. So the Helsinki Accords are the greatest showing of solidarity between Eastern Europe and Western Europe in the Cold War, and it happens during the Detente period. Good? Good. Not done yet. Threats to Detente. Some reasons why Detente might not work the way that we had hoped they would work. Many in the United States felt that these treaties benefited the Soviet Union more than they benefited the United States. They felt that we could be trusted, that we would be honorable, but we didn't believe that the Soviet Union maybe would be honorable following those treaty agreements. And then some stuff that started going down in the Middle East and in Africa started to make us think that the Soviet Union still wanted to be an expansionist power. For example, in October 1973, in what's known as the October 1973 War, or also referred to as the Yom Kippur War. We'll talk more about that in the Arab-Israeli studies. The United States suspected the Soviet Union of knowing that this war was going to happen and not informing us. Like, we were all détente at this period. They should have told us. But they didn't. The Soviets also supported war in Angola, a newly independent African nation. The Soviets also were supporting Somalia. Soviets were also supporting Ethiopia in their small war against Somalia in 1977. So despite Detente happening, the Soviet Union is still supporting aggressive actions around the world. The United States also had serious doubts over the Soviets' true commitment to human rights. And rightfully so. So we got some threats to Detente. Now, one aspect of Detente that we didn't mention yet is what was going on in China, and we will get into this a little bit more deeply in a couple days. But with regard to China, the United States and China would also work on easing relations. The United States in the early 1970s would drop our objections to China being on the United Nations Security Council. If you remember, that started back in 1950. Well, now by 1972, the United States is going to say, China, Communist China, People's Republic of China, you can be on the Security Council again. We were just kidding. The United States would also limit trade restrictions, or start to end trade and travel restrictions to China. President Nixon would go to China, be the first American president to go to the People's Republic of China, or China at large. So we've got easing tensions all around, whether it be between the Soviet Union and the United States, or China and the United States, or Eastern Europe and Western Europe. But what brings Detente to an ultimate end? In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. A little background, if we recall, when Leonid Brezhnev came to power, he issued what was known as the Brezhnev Doctrine, that communist countries have an obligation to support other communist countries against threats. It was their version of the Truman Doctrine. Well, in the late 1970s, the communist government in Afghanistan, the Soviet-friendly government in Afghanistan, was being threatened by possible internal revolt. A lot of people in Afghanistan were not supportive of that government. So in 1979, the Soviet Union rolled their tanks into Afghanistan under the goal of supporting the current government of Afghanistan. Much like the United States went into South Vietnam to support the government of South Vietnam. For the United States, this would show us the true Soviet intentions around the world, or what we believed to be now the real Soviet intentions, as they were just trying to spread Soviet-style communism. Because of this invasion, those SALT II treaties would never go through. We would limit our exports to the Soviet Union, and we would even withdraw from the 1980 Summer Olympics in Moscow. Oh yeah, it's getting as serious as sports. Now, for those of you that know a little bit about it, this is one of those like truth is stranger than fiction stories. You guys might remember the story of the 1980 Winter Olympics. See, now we've kind of jumbled our Olympic Games. They used to just be every 4 years, Winter and Summer Olympics. But then we like jumbled them up a little bit, so now every 2 years there is either a Winter Olympics or a Summer Olympics. So in 1980, you had Winter Olympics held where? Someone knows. Close, New York, in Lake Placid, New York. And in 1980, the Summer Olympics were to be held in Moscow. Well, the 1980 Winter Olympics is, of course, the story of what? Why does everybody remember the 1980 Winter Olympics? This is the Miracle on Ice, where the American hockey team, in ridiculous circumstances, defeated the Soviet national team. And this was crazy, because at this time, this was before the Dream Team. Like, American Olympic athletes had to be amateurs at this time. You couldn't be a professional athlete and compete for the United States Olympic team. So, like, when we played basketball, for example, in 1972, the United States infamously lost to Russia. It was totally cheating, like the refs screwed it up. But anyway, the United States lost to Russia in basketball in 1972. And this was crazy, because, like, basketball was, well, Canada's game, but we were better at it. Basketball was like an American kind of game. And the Russians beat us at it? What? But really, it was American college kids as our Olympic team playing against like grown Russian men, right? Who were like professionals in the sense that the Soviet Union had professional sports. The same went for hockey in 1980. American college students who aren't even the best college, like the United States doesn't produce nearly as many hockey players that play in the NHL, for example, as Canada does, and as Europe does, as Russia does. The United States, we're just kind of a little bit behind in hockey because most of our country doesn't freeze up. So American hockey players, American collegiate hockey players, were playing in these Olympic Games against the Soviet national team. Grown men who have spent their lives playing hockey. They're just bigger and stronger and faster and more skilled than these Americans. And crazy enough, the Americans beat them. Now, what a lot of people forget, if you haven't watched the movie or if you don't know all about the story, when the United States beat the Soviets, that was in like the semifinal matchup. We still had to win the gold after that, which we did, so that was cool. But we still had to win another game after we beat the Russians. But that would have been akin to, like, now, the American Dream Team basketball. This all changed in the mid-'90s, where we started to let our professionals play in the Olympics, and then it just got stupid. When the best American basketball players could play against the rest of the world, it was not even close. That's starting to change. There's now more competition around the world, for basketball at least. But at this time, it was just amateurs. So it would have been akin to amateurs from, I don't know, any other country of the world defeating the best NBA players that we throw at the Olympics now. So this was crazy. It was a shock to the system, and it wasn't just like an American hockey team beating a Soviet hockey team. It was an American underdog hockey team beating, like, the cheating Soviets, because they used professional men, beating the Soviets amidst the invasion of Afghanistan and a rekindling of Cold War tensions. All right? This is serious business. Well, with the invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, President Jimmy Carter will not allow American Olympic athletes to go to Moscow to compete. Now, imagine this. Those of you that are Olympic caliber athletes. Many of you get one shot. The Olympics only comes around every 4 years. For most Olympic athletes, you get one chance to do it. All right? Maybe a couple go twice. Maybe some rare athletes go 3 or 4 times. But for most, it's just one chance, because then you're out of your prime, right? For those Olympic athletes, between 1977 and 1983, they wouldn't get a chance to compete in the Olympics because Jimmy Carter boycotted the Moscow-held Olympics. All in all, it wasn't a big story, but it did create a little bit of the tit-for-tat nature of the Olympic Games. Because in 1984, because you could not script this any better, because all of this was pre-planned in advance. In 1984, where were the Olympic Games held? Los Angeles, California. And the Soviets boycotted ours. So 1980 and 84 Olympic Games were kind of crazy because in 80, the Soviet Union cleaned up. In 84, we cleaned up because our chief adversary in those Olympics games didn't show up. All right? Anyhow, ultimately, those didn't have that big of a deal on the development of the Cold War, but it was a side effect of it. So the question is, was Detente a failure? Some argue that it was a success because we avoided nuclear confrontation for another decade. So, yay, Detente. Tensions were reduced for that time period. Some in America, though, will argue that the Detente period actually made the United States weaker. It allowed the Soviet Union to strengthen itself while holding the United States back. And ultimately, Detente failed because it allowed the Soviet Union to stay in existence, to continue to be an entity. This will spur the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. Ronald Reagan, we've talked about him, the former actor who was the president of the Screen Actors Guild that helped out the HUAC, House Un-American Activities Committee, hearings back in the 1950s. Ronald Reagan is eventually going to be the governor of California, and he's going to run for president of the United States. And he is going to be elected overwhelmingly in 1980 when he runs against Jimmy Carter on a wave of anti-communist sentiment in the United States, unlike anything we've seen since the 1950s. Running on a campaign that he would reassert American power and prestige once he's elected president. He openly talked about Detente being a failure, that it was a one-way street, that the United States was making concessions while the Soviet Union was strengthening itself. Upon his election, Ronald Reagan will revert the arms reductions agreements that had begun under the SALT treaties and begin to develop new delivery agents, new missile delivery systems, like what's known as the B-2 stealth bomber. We still fly these today. Sometimes you see them at sporting events doing flyovers. The B-2 stealth bomber. Now we have a bomber that can not only carry nuclear weapons to anywhere on the planet that we'd want to, they're hardly detectable by enemy radar. So we can fly over you, but you can't see us anymore. And a new submarine, a new nuclear submarine that could take sub-launched ballistic missiles anywhere on the planet, and they can stay underwater for seemingly indefinite amounts of time. So those guys need to eat again. Reagan would also start to develop, and we've already talked about this, what was known as Star Wars by the media, or his SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative. His plan to put anti-missile technology into space so we could zap out of the sky any incoming Soviet missiles from space. Reagan would also launch what was known as the Reagan Doctrine, the final doctrine we are ever going to have to talk about in this class, where the United States would begin to give assistance to anti-communist insurgents and governments in Latin America and South America. We would begin to, again, support, much like we did under Eisenhower in the 50s. using our CIA to give support to anti-communist forces in Central and South America. Reagan used a lot of fiery rhetoric against the Soviet Union. He called the Soviet Union in his State of the Union address in 1981 upon taking office as president. He called the Soviet Union the evil empire and the focus of evil in the modern world. All of this rhetoric, all of this talk, all of this weapons development ends détente and brings in what is known as the Second Cold War. And this is the early 1980s. A new era of tensions in the Cold War period. It is the Second Cold War and the fear of nuclear war, again, that creates the movie War Games that we watched in class not too long ago, right? The Soviet Union in the early 1980s, Brezhnev is going to die in 1982. Brezhnev is going to die in 1982. And the Soviet Union will go through a few years of aging and weak leadership. Guys that history has largely forgotten. A guy named Andropov and another guy named Chernenko. You don't even need to write them down because you won't remember them either. But generally seen as weak leadership, not sure who's even in charge of the Soviet Union anymore. And in, in 1983, the Soviet Union will shoot down a Korean passenger airliner, killing over 250 people. The plane went off course. The plane went off course and was flying over Soviet airspace. And the Soviet anti-aircraft artillery opened fire and shot down this plane. And over 250 people were killed. This is not the kind of thing that happens during détente. This is the kind of thing that happens amidst serious Cold War tensions, where the Soviet Union can't just feel like it can overlook a plane flying over its airspace, and they shoot down this Korean airliner. The Cold War is back on. It's called the Second Cold War. It comes because of an end of détente, because of an invasion of Afghanistan, because of an election of Ronald Reagan.